Most people believe they are investing. They are not. They are simply moving money in movement. Without discipline is one of the quietest ways wealth disappears. Solomon understood this. The wisdom preserved in the Book of Proverbs was never concerned with how often capital moved. It was concerned with how carefully it was protected. True investing is not an action. It is a form of restraint. If that challenges everything you were taught about money, stay until the end. There is a quiet anxiety that follows modern investors everywhere they go. It lives in the habit of checking a portfolio before breakfast. It appears in the reflex of opening a financial app during a lunch break, scanning numbers that shifted slightly since the last check an hour before. It is present in the restless feeling that money sitting still is money being wasted. Most people recognize this anxiety. Very few question it. And that failure to question it, that simple, almost invisible acceptance may be the single most expensive habit a person can carry through their financial life. This is not a conversation about which assets to buy. It is not a breakdown of market timing or portfolio theory, but this is something older, something quieter, a framework that existed long before financial apps, long before brokerage accounts, long before the modern world decided that movement was the same thing as progress. Most people believe that putting money into markets automatically makes them investors. The word itself carries a certain identity. An investor sounds disciplined, intentional, intelligent, and so the behavior gets labeled as investing, regardless of whether it actually builds wealth or quietly erodes it. But there is a distinction that ancient wisdom preserved for a reason, a distinction between the person who moves capital and the person who controls it. That distinction is where this begins. Consider what modern financial culture actually teaches. The message, delivered through apps and headlines and casual workplace conversations, is consistent. Your money must always be working. Idle capital is losing capital. Opportunity waits for no one. Every week without a new position is a week of potential growth abandoned. And so people act. They rotate, they research. They diversify into new sectors, respond to earnings reports, follow trends that financial media describes as important. The activity feels like discipline. It feels like responsibility. It produces a particular kind of psychological satisfaction, the feeling that something is being done. This is the first illusion of modern wealth, that financial activity and financial progress are the same thing. They are not. A salaried worker earning a reasonable income allocates a portion of savings each month across several investment vehicles. He reads about the market. He adjusts when conditions shift. He responds to headlines that suggest opportunity. Over a decade, he has made hundreds of financial decisions. His account has moved in multiple directions. He has experienced gains, corrections, fees, and reallocations. At the end of that decade, he is not dramatically wealthier than when he began. He is financially tired, and he cannot fully explain why. The activity felt like investing. By every modern definition, it was investing. But the outcome does not reflect what the effort promised. This pattern is not rare. It is the standard experience of the active modern investor, and it contains a lesson that ancient wealth traditions understood with complete clarity. Movement is not always progress. The wisdom tradition associated with Solomon, the writings preserved in the Book of Proverbs, was not primarily concerned with financial instruments. It was concerned with the principles that govern human behavior around wealth. The psychology of accumulation. The discipline required to protect what has been built. The patience that separates those who acquire wealth from those who merely handle money. Ancient households studied these principles, not as spiritual exercises disconnected from practical life, but as operational frameworks. Rules for managing resources across generations. The distinction between a household that grows over time and one that remains permanently fragile was not primarily a matter of intelligence or opportunity. It was a matter of discipline. Ancient households understood this clearly. Capital, in the framework of these traditions, was treated with a reverence that modern culture has largely abandoned. Not because capital itself was sacred, but because the discipline required to protect it reflected something about character. A household that could not restrain the impulse to constantly deploy resources would never accumulate the reserves necessary for genuine strength. This is not metaphor, it is structural reality. The seed that is planted before it is protected will not survive poor conditions. The merchant who deploys all resources into every available opportunity will have nothing left when a genuinely rare opportunity emerges. The household that treats every month as an opportunity to invest leaves itself permanently exposed. Solomon observed this pattern long ago, and the observations survive because it is not a cultural artifact. It is a description of how capital actually behaves across time. Here is the assumption that must be examined carefully. The modern world has attached the word investing to a behavior. That behavior involves regularly allocating available funds into financial instruments. The assumption embedded in this behavior is that consistent allocation leads to consistent growth, that more decisions produce better outcomes, that staying active in markets is the mark of financial intelligence. This assumption deserves a direct question. If frequent investing were inherently wise, why do the majority of active retail investors underperform simple, passive strategies? Why do households that make constant financial decisions frequently end up in the same position a decade later? Why does the feeling of control that comes with constant activity so rarely translate into actual financial stability? The answer is not that the markets are unfair. The answer is structural. Every time capital moves, it is exposed. It becomes subject to timing decisions, which are rarely perfect. It encounters fees, which are consistently extracted. It follows emotional responses to conditions that may or may not reflect genuine opportunity. It is deployed with the psychology of the moment rather than the clarity of a long-term framework. The more often capital moves, the more often it is exposed to each of these forces. Disciplined wealth builders do not prioritize action, they prioritize control. This is the shift. This is the distinction between what most people call investing and what ancient tradition understood as wealth stewardship. Capital that moves constantly is capital that is constantly vulnerable. Capital that is protected, held with discipline, moved only when genuine conditions justify the risk, becomes something different. It becomes leverage. It becomes strength. It becomes the foundation from which real decisions can be made. This principle has a name. In the framework that this narration follows, it is called the law of reserved capital. The law of reserved capital states that a permanent portion of capital must remain untouched and protected at all times. Not invested, not reallocated, not waiting for the next opportunity. Protected. This reserve is not an emergency fund in the conventional sense. It is not money set aside for unexpected expenses. It is something more deliberate. It is the structural acknowledgement that wealth is not built by maximizing investment. It is built by controlling when and how capital is deployed. The law of reserve capital changes the psychology of every financial decision that follows it. When a person maintains a protected reserve, they observe opportunities from a position of strength. They are not searching for somewhere to put money. They are evaluating whether a specific condition justifies the movement of capital out of protection. This is a different posture entirely. It is the posture of a decision maker rather than a reactor. The constant investor reacts. The disciplined capital guardian evaluates. Wealth respects restraint. The first structural layer of this law involves understanding what protection actually accomplishes. When capital is preserved rather than deployed, it does not simply sit idle. It performs a function that constant investment cannot replicate. It maintains a psychological environment that makes clear thinking possible. Consider what happens when all available capital is invested. Every market movement becomes personally relevant. Our correction is not simply a market event, it is a direct reduction in personal financial stability. Decisions made during corrections are often emotional, reactive, and poorly timed. Assets are sold when prices are low. New positions are taken with money that cannot afford to absorb further decline. The fully invested individual has no space between themselves and the market's movement. Now consider the individual who maintains a permanent reserve. A correction is still a market event. It may be uncomfortable to observe, but it does not threaten the structural stability of the household. The reserve remains intact. The investor observes without being compelled to react. And in certain conditions, when price corrections create genuinely rare opportunities, that reserve becomes the instrument of deliberate action. Capital must first be protected before it can ever be multiplied. This is not passive wisdom. It is structural mechanics. The protected reserve creates optionality, the ability to choose rather than react. And that ability, compounded across years and decades, explains a significant portion of what separates households that grow from households that remain permanently exposed. Ancient households understood this clearly. Here is where the identity shock arrives. Most people, upon examining the behavior of generationally wealthy families, expect to find constant financial activity, sophisticated strategies, aggressive positioning, a relentless pursuit of returns. What research and historical observation consistently reveal is something different. Generationally wealthy households intentionally leave large portions of capital inactive. Not because they lack investment knowledge, not because opportunities are unavailable, but because inactivity is a deliberate strategic choice. The reserve is maintained with the same intentionality that others apply to their most aggressive investments. This inactivity is not neglect. It is discipline. And it is a discipline that most active investors never develop, because modern financial culture provides no framework for it. Every tool, every app, every financial publication is designed to facilitate movement. The infrastructure of modern investing has no category for protected capital, no reward signal for restraint, no headlines celebrating the household that chose not to act this month. But the wealthy measure success differently. They do not count the number of investments made. They track the strength and stability of what remains protected. They understand that the reserve is not the money they did not invest, it is the foundation from which all future strength is drawn. Quiet discipline builds lasting capital. The viewer who arrives at this understanding carries a question with them into the next consideration. If the protected reserve is so powerful, why does it remain so uncommon? Why does financial culture consistently point in the opposite direction? The answer is not complicated, but it is worth examining carefully. Financial activity generates revenue for the infrastructure that surrounds it. Transactions produce fees. Frequent decisions generate engagement. Movement creates the data that financial services monetize. The system is not designed to encourage restraint, because restraint does not serve the system's interests. This is not a conspiracy. It is simply incentive structure. And when people operate inside a system whose incentives point toward constant movement, they naturally adopt the values that system rewards. Activity feels virtuous. Patience feels like missed opportunity. The disciplined reserve holder feels, at times, like they are falling behind. This feeling is false. But it is consistent. And it is one of the primary psychological challenges the law of reserve capital presents. The discipline test is not primarily financial, it is psychological. Resisting the urge to act, to remain still while markets move. While colleagues discuss new positions, while financial media presents its next urgent development requires a different kind of strength than most people associate with wealth building. It requires the understanding that not every opportunity is meant to be taken. That many situations that appear to demand a decision are actually invitations to react emotionally. That the household which moves only when genuine conditions justify movement has already separated itself from the majority of investors who move because movement feels like progress. Two types of financial thinkers exist, and every person who handles money belongs to one category or the other. The first type reacts. They engage with opportunity when it appears, adjust when conditions shift, and measure their discipline by the quality of their decisions. Their financial identity is built around action. They feel most competent when they are engaged. The second type observes. They have established a framework, a permanent reserve, a clear set of conditions that must exist before capital moves, a psychological commitment to restraint. Their financial identity is not built around decisions made. It is built around a structure maintained. The first type will make more financial decisions over a lifetime. The second type will make fewer and will make them from a position of genuine strength. The question is not which approach feels more natural. The question is which approach actually produces lasting wealth. Ancient tradition preserved this answer carefully. Patience filters opportunity. And within that filtering, within the discipline of the protected reserve maintained through market cycles and social pressure and the constant noise of modern financial culture, something begins to form that no single investment decision could ever produce. A foundation, not of returns, not of allocations, but of identity. The identity of someone who understands that wealth begins not with what capital is put into, but with what capital is protected from. That understanding changes everything that follows. There is a second layer to the law of reserved capital. Most people, upon encountering the first layer, understand the logic of preservation. They accept, at least intellectually, that protecting capital before deploying it creates a stronger position. That a permanent reserve changes the psychology of decision-making. That restraint is not passivity, it is structure. But understanding the logic is not the same as understanding the mechanism. The first layer explains why the reserve matters. The second layer reveals what the reserve actually does, the hidden, structural advantage that compound patience produces across time. And this is the layer that most financial conversations never reach, because reaching it requires abandoning the assumptions that modern investment culture was built upon. The second principle of the law of reserved capital states this clearly. Capital should move only when conditions justify the risk, not when opportunity appears. Not when markets are rising, and not when the psychological pressure of inactivity becomes uncomfortable. Only when conditions justify the risk. This distinction matters more than it initially sounds. The modern investor is trained to recognize opportunity. Financial education, in almost every form it takes, is fundamentally a curriculum in opportunity identification. Which sectors are growing? Which assets are undervalued? Which timing signals suggest entry? The entire framework points outward, toward the market, toward the opportunity, toward the next decision. The disciplined capital guardian is trained differently. Their attention is not primarily directed outward toward opportunity. It is directed inward toward conditions. Before any capital moves, a set of internal conditions must be satisfied. The risk must be clearly understood, not estimated. The timing must reflect genuine alignment, not impatience. The opportunity must meet a threshold that has been established in advance, not constructed in the moment to justify a decision already made emotionally. This inward orientation is rare. It is also extraordinarily powerful. When the evaluation begins internally rather than externally, emotional noise loses most of its influence. The investor who decides in advance what conditions must exist before capital moves cannot be persuaded by market momentum alone. They cannot be moved by a compelling narrative about an emerging sector. They are not reactive to headlines, because headlines do not change internal conditions. They observe, they evaluate, they wait. And when genuine conditions finally align, when the risk is understood, the timing is clear, and the opportunity meets the established threshold, they act with the full force of preserved capital behind them. Patience filters opportunity. This is not a poetic observation. It is a mechanical description of how disciplined capital deployment actually functions. The hidden leva, the structural advantage that reserve capital creates, is a concept that ancient wealth tradition described in practical terms. The word is optionality. When capital is permanently fully deployed, the investor has no choices available during moments of genuine opportunity. A market correction that creates rare purchasing conditions cannot be acted upon by someone who has nothing in reserve. An unexpected situation that demands decisive financial response finds the fully invested household without capacity to respond. Every decision must be made in the context of what is already committed, which means every new decision requires unwinding a previous one, often at an unfavorable moment. The household with protected reserves faces none of these constraints. When conditions deteriorate for the impatient investor, they represent something different for the capital guardian. Not a threat, but an environment, one that may or may not justify action, evaluated calmly against established internal conditions. This asymmetry, the ability to choose while others are forced to react, explains a structural advantage that compounds silently across decades. It does not appear on any single account statement. It does not announce itself as a strategy. It simply produces consistently better decision quality across a lifetime of financial choices. Because those choices are never made from a position of scarcity or desperation. Power in investing comes from readiness, not speed. Solomon observed this pattern long ago. The ancient tradition that preserved his wisdom understood that the household prepared to act is always more powerful than the household compelled to act. And the difference between those two states is not intelligence. It is not timing. It is the discipline to maintain a permanent reserve across the many ordinary months when nothing in the market justifies its use. Here is the psychological challenge that this discipline presents, stated plainly. Restraint feels like falling behind. This feeling is not irrational. It is produced by genuine social and environmental pressure. When colleagues discuss returns from positions taken in rising markets, the individual maintaining a protected reserve feels the weight of inaction. When financial media describes an opportunity as time-sensitive, the reserve holder feels the pull of urgency. When a market rallies and allocated capital produces visible gains, the portion sitting in protected reserve appears, by contrast, to be performing nothing. This appearance is false, but it is persistent. And it creates the primary psychological test of the law of reserve capital. The ability to maintain discipline, not because conditions are comfortable, but because the framework demands it regardless of how conditions feel. Ancient households accepted that many opportunities must be ignored. Not because the opportunities were necessarily poor, but because the discipline of selective action, action taken only when internal conditions align, was worth more than the returns any individual opportunity might produce. This is a difficult trade to accept emotionally. It is not difficult to accept intellectually once the structural logic is understood. The challenge is maintaining that intellectual clarity across months and years of social pressure, market movement, and the constant quiet suggestion that restraint is a form of financial failure. It is not failure. It is the mark of genuine financial maturity. Quiet discipline builds lasting capital. The cultural obsession with financial hustle deserves a calm examination. Modern wealth culture rewards and celebrates a specific archetype: the active, aggressive, constantly engaged investor. The person who races early to track markets, who speaks fluently about positions and strategies, who is always working angles that others have not considered. This archetype carries social status. It produces compelling content. It generates the kind of visible activity that gets interpreted as intelligence. But the results, examined honestly across time, tell a more complicated story. The aggressive, constantly engaged investor experiences high volumes of both gains and losses. The fees generated by constant activity accumulate silently. The emotional decisions made during market stress produce outcomes that calm observation would have prevented. The identity built around financial hustle requires continuous performance, and continuous performance, under uncertain conditions, eventually produces errors that quieter approaches never encounter. Wealth does not require constant activity. It requires disciplined systems that prevent unnecessary risk. This reframe is not comfortable for a culture that has attached virtue to effort. The suggestion that doing less, choosing more carefully, protecting more deliberately, acting more rarely could produce superior long-term outcomes conflicts with deeply held beliefs about how results are earned. But ancient wisdom was not particularly concerned with cultural comfort. The Book of Proverbs did not describe wealth as a reward for the busiest household. It described wealth as the result of disciplined stewardship, of protecting what had been built, of choosing carefully, waiting patiently, and acting with the full strength of preserved resources rather than the partial capacity of a fully deployed position. Generational wealth follows structure, not speed, not volume, not the excitement of constant engagement. Structure. The shift from money to identity is where this framework becomes permanent. There is a difference between understanding the law of reserve capital as a strategy and inhabiting it as an identity. A strategy can be abandoned when it becomes uncomfortable. An identity cannot be set aside without cost to the self-concept that has been built around it. Most financial approaches remain strategies. They are adopted because they appear intelligent, applied when conditions seem favorable, and abandoned when social or emotional pressure suggests an alternative. This is why most financial behavior remains inconsistent across time. The strategy changes. The person underneath it remains the same. The law of reserve capital, practiced with genuine commitment, does not remain a strategy for long. It becomes the lens through which financial reality is evaluated. The investor who has maintained a permanent reserve through a complete market cycle has experienced something that cannot be taught in theory: the clarity of observing chaos from a position of stability. They have watched impatient investors make decisions they themselves were not compelled to make. They have experienced the particular confidence of holding options when others have none. This experience changes the financial identity permanently. Not because returns improved, though they typically do over time, but because the relationship to capital itself has changed. Money is no longer an instrument of constant action. It is a resource to be protected, deployed deliberately, and maintained with the kind of disciplined attention that produces genuine wealth rather than the performance of it. Investing becomes a deliberate act, performed rarely and carefully. Capital preservation becomes the daily discipline. And that daily discipline, practiced quietly, without announcement, without the social validation that active investing attracts, becomes the foundation of financial identity that does not require external confirmation to remain stable. Wealth respects restraint. The practical implementation of this identity begins with a simple, daily habit. Not a financial transaction, not a research session, not a portfolio review that ends with a reapplication. The habit is observation without action. Each day, or each week, the disciplined capital guardian examines their financial position with full attention. They note the state of their reserve. They observe market conditions. They evaluate, against their established internal criteria, whether any current circumstances justify the movement of capital. And then, in the vast majority of cases, they make no changes. This sounds almost too simple to be significant. But the practice of regular observation without reaction trains something that no investment strategy can develop: directly the psychological ability to sit with discomfort, to watch movement without joining it, to resist the pull of urgency that financial environments consistently generate. Over months, this habit becomes effortless. The reflex to react is replaced by the practice of evaluation. The anxiety of inactivity is replaced by the quiet confidence of structural stability. Over years, this habit becomes identity. The person who has practiced observation without action for long enough no longer experiences the restlessness that drives most investors toward constant activity. They have developed what might be called financial patience, not as a temporary posture, but as a permanent characteristic. And financial patience, compounded across a lifetime, produces outcomes that no amount of frantic activity can replicate. A final word about impatience. Impatience is not simply a personality trait. In the financial context, it is a structural vulnerability. It is the gap through which unnecessary risk enters. It is the condition that causes otherwise intelligent people to make decisions they would never make if they had simply waited another 30 days. Impatience is why people buy near market peaks, when the narrative of rising returns makes action feel urgent. It is why people sell during corrections, when fear makes preservation feel impossible. It is why the gap between the returns markets produce and the returns investors actually capture has remained stubbornly wide across every era of modern financial history. The law of reserve capital does not eliminate impatience as a feeling, but it creates a structural barrier between the feeling and the decision. The reserve must be maintained. The internal conditions must be satisfied. The threshold established in advance must be met. These requirements do not ask impatience to disappear. They simply require that it wait long enough for clarity to return. And clarity, in almost every case, produces a different decision than urgency does. Ancient households understood this clearly. Wealth is not determined by how often money moves. This is the conclusion that ancient wisdom preserved, and it is the conclusion that every principle examined in this narration points toward. Not because stillness is inherently virtuous, but because disciplined stillness, the kind produced by a permanent reserve, a clear internal threshold, and a practiced habit of observation without reaction, creates the structural conditions from which genuine wealth is actually built. The Book of Proverbs described the wise household not as the most active, but as the most prepared. Not as the fastest to identify opportunity, but as the most stable in its response to conditions. Not as the household that made the most decisions, but as the one whose decisions, when made, were made from strength. That strength begins with the reserve. It is maintained through the discipline of restraint. It compounds through the habit of patient observation. And it becomes permanent when it is no longer a strategy, when it has become, quietly and without announcement, the identity of someone who understands that capital protected is not capital wasted. It is capital waiting. And capital that waits with discipline does not merely survive the conditions that eliminate impatient investors. It emerges from those conditions ready to act, while others are still recovering from having acted too soon. Generational wealth follows structure. Ancient households understood this clearly. And now, perhaps, so do you. The law of reserve capital. Protect first. Deploy deliberately. Wait with strength.